From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. This is when we get you updated on the news that made headlines this week. And today, our panel includes Brian Clark, Idaho Statesman opinion writer, Christina Lords, the editor-in-chief of the Idaho Capital Sun, and Kevin Fixler, investigative reporter with the Idaho Statesman. Welcome, everybody, and happy Friday to you.
Happy Friday, Gemma.
Hello, happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
So, Kevin, let me begin with you because you have been following the developments in the upcoming trial against Bryan Kohberger. So the first thing I want to talk about is this episode of NBC's Dateline that aired last Friday, a week ago. Can you start out by telling us what information was released during the airing of that episode? Because this is information that no one knew about, maybe outside of the investigation.
So as you said, a week ago, Dateline aired a 2-hour special titled The Terrible Night on King Road, which is the street where the 4 victims, University of Idaho students, were stabbed to death. And as you noted, also some unreleased information. And that was to include surveillance video that was from the neighboring home that actually showed a white vehicle coming into the neighborhood and then exiting at 4:20 a.m., which helped police establish the timeline that they believe the homicides occurred. It also included what many would believe incriminating evidence about the defendant, Bryan Kohberger. Google searches directly from his cell phone, selfies taken in the days leading up to his arrest in late December 2022. It was, a multitude of data and information that we just were not familiar with. And certainly has created a stir in this case just 2.5 months before trial.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to say, Kevin, I watched the episode and I was like, oh, didn't know about that. And I mean, and like you, many journalists here locally have followed this case very closely. So I'm assuming, Kevin, as much as you have been following this case, this information that was revealed was I think surprising to everyone.
Yeah, agreed. I also made sure I caught the episode, which had been advertised for some weeks. And surprising is maybe even an understatement about what was revealed, again, so close to trial.
So, Kevin, because there was information released about the investigation during this Dateline that aired that had not been made public, and we should let people know there was a gag order in place in this case. It's been in place, for almost 2 years, I think, Kevin. So what did the judge have to say about this yesterday during the hearing?
Right. So before the hearing actually started, it took about 30 minutes. There was a delay before the media and members of the public were allowed in, and we weren't really sure what was going on. But turns out, and Judge Hippler released this information later into yesterday's public portion of the hearing, that they had a closed door session for about 30 minutes. And at that, during the public portion, you could tell that he was frustrated. And while he was reserved toward the end of the public hearing, what he did was issued an order directly to both sets of attorneys saying they needed to retain all records. And that was over potential investigation into violations of the gag order, which, as you noted, has been standing for more than 2 years. It actually dates to early January 2023, and that was just days after Bryan Kohberger's arrest.
So, Kevin, during this, I mean, the judge basically was concerned that someone has leaked information, but also that this could really have implications for seating a jury. Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, he talked about in a follow-up order that he did issue that he's concerned about not only issues over fair trial rights for the defendant, but also this is a financial burden on taxpayers, specifically out of Latah County, who, although the trial has been moved down here to Boise, they still shoulder the costs, both for Kohberger's attorneys and many of the other standard legal costs that come with putting somebody on trial. So that was certainly a concern for him. And the whole point of a change of venue, at least the argument from the defense, was to get a fair trial. So with a nationally broadcast episode to millions of homes and then people who stream it on a variety of locations, Hulu, Peacock, etc., it does stand to potentially spoil a jury. And he invited the opportunity for a special prosecutor. Although that has not taken place yet, it does. It was something he looked directly at the defense table and basically said, this is on you. If this is something you want to pursue, I'm open to it.
So, Kevin, where does that stand then? Do we know if a special prosecutor will actually be named and if an investigation would happen?
Assuming the defense files for it, that would be, it takes them to be involved in the process and actually make the formal motion and request of the judge. But he did seem to indicate to them that he was open to it, which you don't typically see a judge too often make legal maneuver suggestions to either side. But that was clearly what he was hinting at, and I'm sure that was part of the discussion when they had the closed session, which, again, media and members of the public were not privy to, but we did see his follow-up order for retention of all records. And that also, by the way, that does apply to the defense as well. While Judge Hippler did note it was likely a gag order violation, and he did direct his attention to the prosecution, he does also require that the defense do the same thing with retention of records and also filing a list of anyone who would have been familiar or had access to the materials that were leaked or provided to Dateline.
So another interesting development in court yesterday, Kevin, and tell us what the judge required of the defense in regards to possible other suspects in this case.
A month ago at a hearing, lead defense attorney Ann Taylor noted to the court that while during their review of materials that was granted to them during the discovery process, they came across a tip, and likely that was to law enforcement over a different suspect. And they said they were still investigating that, but a deadline was set for May 14th, that was this week, by Judge Hippler, that if this was going to be an argument they were going to try to make to jurors, an alternative perpetrator, they needed to not only claim, hey, it was not Brian Koberger, and that is something they have said throughout the course of the legal proceedings, that he is absolutely innocent. A not guilty plea was previously entered on his behalf by a judge. And if they're going to try to make that argument during trial, they need to actually provide evidence. And so they met a deadline this week, but he asked that additional evidence be submitted in order to justify their claim, because what was submitted so far, he said, and this is a quote, was potentially fairly objectionable in terms of admissibility. And so they have to meet now a May 23rd deadline, and then the state would have an opportunity to respond by June 6th.
Yeah, I find that ruling fascinating, Kevin, because the burden of proof is always on the prosecution. So to require this evidence by the defense, I am very curious to see how this plays out when the trial moves forward. But with that said, was this the last hearing, even with that May 23rd deadline, Kevin, coming up, before jury selection begins July 30th?
It was to be the final pretrial hearing, but in fact, because he asked for these additional materials, both from the defense, if that's a legal argument they plan to make, and also for the state to have the opportunity to respond, he did schedule another hearing for June 18th. And actually, overnight, I can also see that he scheduled another hearing, and that is actually over what role the document says what role the victims will play. And notably, yesterday during the hearing, Judge Hippler described the two surviving roommates from this attack as victims, specifically of the burglary that occurred before their roommates had been stabbed to death. The other portions related to them yesterday, he stated that they would be granted 2 reserved seats during the course of the trial, though noted he was skeptical that they would have a desire to be there for the entirety of the trial. And then the other thing that he said was that during what he's intending to be a court live stream of the majority of the trial, their testimony would not include visual elements, so it would be audio only for the broadcast. But again, we have a hearing now scheduled for May 21st, which is sealed, meaning closed to the public. Another one about the alternative perpetrators, June 18th. And then ahead of that, nothing else before jury selection, July 30th. Trial is expected to start by August 11th.
All right, Kevin, appreciate all of the reporting you and your team at the Statesman are doing on this. I know it takes a lot, so appreciate that. Christina, I want to switch gears now and talk about a new bipartisan congressional coalition that was launched in regards to public lands. Can you tell us about this?
Sure. So, as the Trump administration is making these sweeping policy changes, well, in nearly all aspects of how the federal government operates at this point, a group of 14 members of the U.S. House have come together to form a public lands caucus. And most of the members are from Western states like Idaho and many of our border states like Montana, Nevada, and Washington, but some are from places like North Carolina and Virginia as well. And public lands have become kind of a major flashpoint as the Trump administration looks at policy changes to help pay for some of this, part of what's in this major budget package that's making its way through Congress right now. This is what Trump is calling his big, beautiful bill. So that might help people remember what we're talking about here. But conservationists and recreators and other people who really love and want to protect federal public lands are sounding the alarm that Trump is signaling that he's willing to sell some of this public land into private ownership to help to continue major tax cuts that he enacted during his first term that were passed by Congress in 2017. And many of these environmental groups and public lands advocates say that those tax cuts will favor wealthy Americans more so than the middle or low income folks. And so they have real angst about some of these proposals. There have been proposals to sell public land already in Utah and Nevada that are really concerning to a lot of, these conservationists and environmental groups.
And Christina, talk to us about how our own representative, Mike Simpson, will be playing a part in this, because I think it's interesting to note that at least here in Idaho, historically, public lands has always been a bipartisan issue. And now we're seeing this on Capitol Hill as well.
Right. So Mike Simpson, who's been in Congress for a long time representing Idaho, has joined this Public Lands Caucus. He'll serve as as vice chairman of the caucus. And he said that, public lands are what makes Idaho, Idaho, and that one of his top priorities is really preserving the access to our public lands. And these are his words, like defending our way of life. He said that he wants to make sure that future generations can enjoy some of the same benefits that the outdoors and recreation opportunities, how we love to hunt and fish here and other recreation hobbies that we all enjoy. He wants to protect those for future generations that as we do today. And I think you make a good point that public lands, you see a lot of interesting groups coming together that don't normally want to work together. You've got hunters, you've got anglers, you've got, biologists and conservationists. And sometimes these folks aren't all on the same page about how to use this public land or how to make, its best use. But I think we are seeing some of these groups come together in ways and saying that we want to keep these public lands in public hands, and we want to make sure that we can maintain access to these spaces in Idaho and across the West that we've just become so accustomed to enjoying.
And there's this push too, it seems, Christina, as you mentioned, by these groups that normally don't work together, coming together, questioning this idea of selling public lands, right? And even saying, why should that pay for tax cuts for the wealthy?
Right. I think that's their main consternation is that, these lands are supposed to be used in perpetuity for multiple uses, forever, essentially. And once we sell off these public lands to private ownership, how do we get them back? How do we lose that access for forever? It's so hard to put the genie back in the bottle after they land in public or in private ownership. And so I think that's the real fear there is once this does happen, there's no way to go back on it, and we lose some of these spaces that make the United States what make the United States and what makes Idaho, Idaho. We just need to protect these places. I think a lot of these conservationists and other groups would say.
So, Christina, Idaho's state revenues are close to $98 million below the Idaho legislature's forecast for the current fiscal year. But my understanding is the revenue collections are more than they were at this time last year. So, why is this all important?
Yes. So each month, the state puts together a revenue projection report to help state officials determine how things like income and sales tax revenue is coming in to help pay for state services. And we just received the April report, and you're right that the state revenue is down about 97.7 million below what the Idaho legislature forecast for the current 2025 fiscal year. It's important to point out that revenue collections are, like you said, more than they were at the same time last year, but they're far under what the legislature was hoping for and projecting with just a few months to go in the fiscal year, which ends June 30th.
So, Christina, how then is sales tax playing a role in all of this?
Yes, so the distribution of sales tax seems to be a driving factor in why revenue is down. So the sales tax goes into the state's general fund, which helps pay for a lot of different aspects of the state's budget and the services that it provides to Idahoans. So we had about 95.6 million less in sales tax distributed to that general fund than last year. However, Lori Wolf, who serves as Idaho's Division of Financial Management Administrator, said there's still a cushion in the state budget to absorb that figure due to some of the budgeting that the legislature did this year, due to the state's economy doing so well. And so she's saying this isn't time to hit the panic button yet. We have a lot of reserves, a lot of funding and reserves that can really help with this.
Okay. However, since they do use these projections to set the budget for next fiscal year, even though she is saying, don't worry, there are some Democrats who are worried. In fact, Christina, aren't they saying we could potentially see budget cuts next session?
Yeah, I think there's a real worry about that. So Lori Wolf did say that they don't anticipate any holdbacks being necessary for this fiscal year in 2025. But remember, that ends here in about 2 months. She said there are no significant concerns about the state budget at this time, but that the state is watching these figures come in very closely. And part of the concern from other state officials, like Senate Minority Leader Melissa Wintrow, who we talked to about this, is that the legislature passed these massive tax cuts this year and has passed massive tax cuts in the last few legislative sessions. So the legislature passed about $400 million in tax cuts this year. That means that there's $400 million less coming into the state general fund as we go through the next fiscal year. So we also have another 50 million essentially coming off the books for the general fund for the new tax credit that allows taxpayer dollars to go toward private education. So we're talking about up to $450 million less coming into the general fund than we had in the past. And now we're down on our projections by about $100 million too. So I think there are people kind of looking around and wondering, like, what does this mean for when we're budgeting for the fiscal year 2026 and in the future as we go through the next legislative session?
Okay, but the one person who is saying nothing to see here and we're fine is the governor. Talk to us about this, because he says that we can afford this $400 million in tax cuts. And as you mentioned, there's still that other 50 million because of this school choice that was passed.
Right. So we went to a press conference that he held in Nampa this week, and Idaho Governor Brad Little said that while there is some concern about the amount of tax cuts, and he said at the beginning of the session, in his budget proposal, he recommended about 100 million instead of the 400 million in tax cuts for Idahoans and for the state. And but on Monday, he did say that he does think that the state can afford that loss of revenue. He said the state has proven that it can give those tax breaks and tax relief to Idahoans while still taking care of the state and its services. And it's, we need to talk about that there's more and more Idahoans all the time to provide services for. But he did say what matters next is how that growth continues in the future. So if the state economy is doing good, essentially he's saying we'll be all right, that the state can afford this. But officials do need to watch the books closely in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. If there's a major economic downturn, or, the other piece of this is that the federal government is saying that we're going to provide less money for things like SNAP benefits and food stamps. And provide less money for all sorts of different things. And so does the state then pick up some of those costs? When we talk about Medicaid and some of the conversations going on in Congress there, are we picking up the tab for our Medicaid expansion population? And what does that mean for the state budget? So there's just a lot. Right now everything is good and happy and well, and our economy is doing well here in Idaho. But with some of these federal changes and any change in the wind in the economy, it could really mean something different in the coming years.
Yeah, and with that said, Brian, let's talk Medicaid because you recently wrote an opinion piece about the possibility of federal work requirements for folks on Medicaid. Can you start by explaining your reasoning as to why this is not a great idea to put these federal work requirements in place?
Sure. So work requirements, both at the federal state level for Medicaid and also for food stamps or SNAP, as it's officially called. These are all things that are being contemplated at the federal and the state level all over right now, and they all suffer from the same central flaw, which is that there's a notion that there are a whole lot of people out there who are capable of working and on assistance programs but are not working. That just isn't true. There's a recent study by the Urban Institute that looked at the impact of federal work requirements, and it estimates that it would result in about 5 million people losing Medicaid coverage. The particularly important thing about that is that nearly all of those people are either working or specifically exempt from working, either because they're disabled or for other reasons like that. And this is kind of the central double bind of work requirements. And it's been seen where they've been implemented in relation to a variety of programs. They if you don't kick people who deserve benefits off the program, you actually don't save any money because it costs something to administer the programs, and there aren't that many people who will get kicked off if you're only kicking off people who shouldn't be getting benefits. On the other hand, if you fail to kick off a bunch of people who do deserve benefits, then you don't save any money. So that's the reason why it's a particularly ineffective policy.
With that said, Brian, the state of Idaho is looking at implementing its own work requirements outside of what the federal government decides to do. How does that impact, and how many Idahoans are we talking about who this could potentially impact?
Yeah, that's right. As part of a compromise bill that was passed at the end of the last legislative session with regard to Medicaid expansion, initially there was a bill that would basically have resulted in the repeal of Medicaid expansion in all likelihood. That was blocked in the Senate, and a compromise bill came forward that would it lets the state apply for a waiver that would let it implement its own work requirements for Medicaid expansion. That same study found that might result in about 20,000 people being kicked off of Medicaid in Idaho. And again, these are almost all people who are either working or who are specifically exempt from working. The reason they wind up losing coverage is that it's one thing to work. It's another thing to prove to a bureaucracy over and over again that you are working. And if you're involved in gig work, if you're involved in sort of very low income work with odd hours, it can be hard to simply comply with all the paperwork requirements. And that's why people get kicked off. It's because they can't do the paperwork, not because they aren't working.
Yeah, what was interesting to me reading your article, Brian, was you pointed out, and I believe this was by a nonpartisan group, that some folks don't even have something like internet, right? And so if you put all of these requirements in place that they have to get online and they have to fill out the requirement and they have to do it over and over again, if you don't have access to something like internet, that could hinder your ability to be reporting that you're working.
Yeah, and that's especially common. A lot of the Medicaid expansion population is in rural parts of Idaho, and rural parts of Idaho have often have very poor internet service available. And if you're already low income, it can be out of your price range. And things like libraries can, where you could do this
Mhm.
through other means, can be far away, difficult to get to. If people don't have transportation, all of these things are things that can result in them losing healthcare coverage despite the fact that they're working.
Christina, I've got about 2 minutes left. Can you tell us about a new legislative committee that will look at finding barriers, but they're saying also solutions to the housing crisis we have here in our state?
Right. So, I think we've all written stories and talked about the rising cost of housing in the Treasure Valley and really all around the state for a very long time. And when residents are polled, like the public policy poll at that Boise State's conduct every year, it's like housing affordability is a top concern for Idahoans. And so Ali Rabi, a Boise Democrat, she's a senator, worked this session to make sure that the legislature passed a concurrent resolution to establish a committee made up of legislators and other community members to study housing issues and then make the recommendations about their findings to the legislature. So they're talking about a wide range of issues and potential solutions, such as different changes to how permitting processes work for housing development, how to increase housing inventory, how to address building codes, those sort of things. And they're really looking for how other states are doing this, how what's working in certain places and not others. But this new committee will meet at least 3 more times before the next legislative session in January starts throughout the state. I think they're trying to reach a wide variety of people and hear their experiences. And you can find those dates on the legislature's website or in this story, our story at idahocapitalsun.com.
All right. Well, I sure appreciate everyone taking time out of your busy schedules to talk with us today. We've been speaking with Brian Clark, Idaho Statesman opinion writer, Christina Lords, the editor-in-chief of the Idaho Capital Sun, and Kevin Fixler, investigative reporter with the Idaho Statesman. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.